Thanksgiving at my mother's house had always followed the same unspoken script. The table was set perfectly polished silverware cloth napkins folded into triangles, candles flickering like we were about to film a commercial. The turkey always smelled amazing. So did the cinnamon rolls, the sweet potatoes, the pie. On the surface, it was all warmth and tradition. But underneath it, it was a theater, and my brother Brad was always the star. He sat at the head of the table just like every year, leaning back with that casual, easy confidence that made it look like he belonged there. Brad didn't need to try. He never had. People made room for him without being asked. And my mother Diane, well, she made sure the spotlight stayed firmly on him. Her voice would light up whenever she said his name. Her stories always seemed to circle back to something Brad had accomplished. Bought a car, got promoted, closed on a house. You'd think he cured cancer with the way she spoke about him. And me, I was Natalie. The quiet one. The one who helped clear the plates. The one no one ever asked real questions about. It always started the same way. Once the plates were filled and the small talk ran its course, Diane would lean in with that familiar sparkle in her eye. The kind that signaled she had an announcement, a performance to begin. She lifted her wine glass like a baton, ready to conduct the room's admiration. So she said, drawing the word out like a stage cue, Brad just closed on the most beautiful home. 4 bedrooms, updated kitchen. The yard is to die for. It's a real investment, you know. Something with a future. The room hummed with predictable approval. Aunt Barbara gave a little gasp of delight. My cousin Lisa clapped softly. Brad, of course, didn't look up from his plate. He just gave that modest half-smile he'd perfected over the years, the kind that said, "Oh, stop, but do keep going." I took a sip of water, not wine, not yet. Then, right on schedule, Diane turned her eyes toward me. I knew the look before she even tilted her head. "Sweetheart," she said, that soft, overly sympathetic tone coating every syllable. "When are you finally going to settle down?" There it was. The line. The one I'd heard a dozen different ways over the years, wrapped in concern, laced with condescension. It didn't matter how I answered. It never had. Anything short of a ring, a mortgage and a photo-ready family was a disappointment, something to politely acknowledge then quickly shift back to Brad. For years, I played along. I smiled, laughed, gave vague answers. "Oh, someday," or "I'm just figuring things out." I let it slide, because causing a scene would only prove her point right. But this year was different. Not because I had something to prove, but because I no longer cared if she approved. That shift in me wasn't loud. It was quiet, subtle, like the way you realize one morning that you've stopped missing someone who never really showed up for you in the first place. So I looked up from my plate and met her eyes, calm and steady, and I smiled. But it wasn't the kind of smile she was expecting. I let the silence stretch. Let it settle into the room like a slow fog. Diane's question still hovered in the air, delicate but heavy, waiting for me to respond the way I always had, with a polite smile, a soft deflection, a nod to their version of what a real life looked like. But this time I was done with that. I reached for my wine calm and deliberate, letting the glass rest for a second in my hand before taking a measured sip. It was just long enough to make Brad shift in his seat. Just long enough for Diane to glance toward him expecting a joke at my expense. Just long enough for everyone to realize I wasn't going to smooth it over. I set my glass down gently. Then I looked straight at my mother, and I smiled. Not the kind of smile that asks permission, the kind that makes people sit up. "Oh," I said, my voice even. "I already did." Diane blinked. "Did what? Settle down?" I said, still smiling. "I just didn't invite anyone who doubts me." Her fork hit the plate with a sharp clink that echoed louder than it should have. No one spoke. Not Aunt Barb, not Lisa, not even Brad. They all looked at me like I'd just said something indecent. Or impossible. Diane's mouth opened slightly, her eyes wide with confusion, as if the very idea that I had a life outside her knowledge was not just strange, but offensive. I didn't look away. I let her sit with it, with all the assumptions that had just cracked like thin glass. with the quiet message behind my words, "You never saw me. You never asked. And I don't need you to." And that was just the beginning. I didn't rush. I let the silence linger, let it do the heavy lifting. Sometimes stillness carries more weight than any raised voice ever could. And that night, it was doing exactly that. Aunt Barb was the first to move. She reached for the mashed potatoes like her hands needed something to do. But even then, she kept sneaking glances in my direction like she was trying to connect the Natalie she thought she knew with the one sitting in front of her. Diane cleared her throat. "So, where is this house of yours?" Her voice was measured now, no longer dripping with sweetness, just thin cautious. She was trying to reestablish footing to remind the table that she still had the authority to ask the questions. I gave a small shrug. "Not far," I said, reaching for the bread basket. "Maybe 20 minutes, depending on traffic." The way the room leaned in at that answer, it was almost funny. Not just curiosity, hunger. For details, for control, for context, they never bothered to seek before. It was the kind of attention I hadn't received at that table in years, maybe ever. Brad's smirk flickered at the edges. 20 minutes, he repeated with forced casualness. "What kind of place is it?" I didn't answer right away. I took my time buttering my roll. Then, still calm, still perfectly unbothered, I said, "Just over 4,000 square feet." That was when the energy shifted for good. Lisa let out a soft whistle. Barb blinked hard. Diane's hand tensed around her fork. Even Brad leaned back slightly, his jaw tightening as he processed the number. It wasn't a brag. I didn't say it like it was impressive. I said it like it was ordinary, like it was just a fact. And that more than the number itself was what unsettled them. Diane forced a smile. "Well, that sounds sizable," she said. "But don't you think that's a bit much for someone on their own?" There it was, the subtle tug back, the instinct to reframe it, to remind me that success, if not shared on their terms, didn't really count. I looked at her and gave a slow, easy nod. "Maybe I said, but I paid in full. So it's not exactly a burden." Her face twitched. Brad's hand tightened around his glass. And just like that, the story they'd all told themselves about me began to slip through their fingers. Diane tried to hold her composure, but I could see the small signs of strain, the tightness in her shoulders, the way her fingers curled around her fork like it might float away if she didn't anchor it. The pause, barely a second before she found her voice again. "How long have you had it?" she asked. There was something underneath her tone now, not just curiosity, something more brittle, a little too polite, like someone trying not to show just how far behind they felt in a conversation they thought they were leading. "Almost a year," I said. "That did it." Her eyes flicked toward Brad. His smirk faltered just enough to show the crack. He covered it with a sip of wine, but his grip on the glass was rigid. A full year, and they hadn't known a thing. No housewarming party, no photos, no breadcrumb trail on social media. Nothing. I'd built something entirely my own, and they had missed it because they never thought to ask. Diane tried again. "Why didn't you tell us?" Her voice wasn't sharp this time. It was softer, but not warm wounded. And that was new. I tilted my head slightly as if I needed a moment to think. "I didn't." "I guess it just never came up," I said. I let the words settle. She had no comeback, no easy retort. Brad let out a short laugh. "Come on, Natalie," he said, shaking his head. "A house is a pretty big deal. Kind of weird to keep it a secret, don't you think?" I met his gaze calmly. "Not really," I said. "It's not like anyone ever asked." Brad sat forward, just slightly, elbows resting on the edge of the table like he was getting ready to reestablish dominance. "What kind of place did you even buy?" he asked. His tone was casual on the surface, but there was something underneath, something forced, like he was already trying to shape the narrative before the details arrived. I knew exactly what he was doing. I'd seen it for years. Minimize, redirect, dismiss. I didn't give him the satisfaction of hurrying my answer. I picked up my wine glass, swirled it slowly, took a quiet sip. Then I looked directly at him. "Oh," I said like it had just occurred to me. "It's bigger than yours." The silence that followed was instant. Not stunned, not offended, just still. Like the room needed a moment to absorb what had just been said. Brad's smirk flickered again, just a twitch at the corner, but his fingers tightened around his glass. His jaw tensed. He didn't like being on the back foot. Not here. Not in front of Diane. Not at this table where for so long he'd been the untouchable one. Diane blinked rapidly. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. No clever deflection. No protective praise. Aunt Barb, ever curious, leaned in. "Bigger?" she asked. "How big are we talking?" I didn't answer right away. I let them want it. Let them sit in the unfamiliar space of not knowing everything about me. Finally, I said lightly, "Just over 4,000 square feet." The quiet gasp from Barb was almost comical. Diane's breath caught, and Brad didn't say a word. But he didn't have to. His silence said plenty. Diane tried to recover. She clasped her hands together in her lap, sat up straighter, and forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Well, Brad's home is lovely too," she said brightly, her voice just a little too loud. "And it's in such a nice neighborhood. A smart investment." Brad exhaled through his nose and sat taller, clearly grateful for the assist. "Yeah," he said. "You know real estate's all about timing. I got a great deal." Aunt Barb tilted her head. "Wait," she said, setting down her fork. "You didn't pay for it in full." The question hit harder than she intended. It sliced through the fabric of Diane's narrative with a single sentence. Brad paused just a fraction of a second, but it was long enough. "Well, no," he admitted. "Most people don't, right? That's not really how it works." I gave a soft hum, nodding slowly. "That's fair," I said. "Some of us just prefer not to owe anyone anything." Brad didn't respond. His jaw clenched. His knuckles were white against the base of his wine glass, and I knew I'd just touched a nerve. For the first time, the golden boy didn't look so golden. I leaned back in my chair, let my fingers graze the rim of my plate, and turned my gaze toward him. "So," I said gently, "how's your mortgage, Brad?" His mouth twitched. It was barely visible, but it was there. Diane looked between us, clearly sensing the tension, but not yet understanding where it was headed. "Brad's doing just fine," she said quickly. "He's responsible. He always has been." I tilted my head. "Is that so?" Brad's eyes flicked toward me, narrowed. "You like to talk about success," I said evenly. "You like to act like you've got it all figured out. But the truth is, you didn't really buy that house, did you?" He froze. And for a split second I saw something I'd never seen in him before. Fear. "You what?" Diane said, looking sharply at him. "What is she talking about?" I didn't blink. "Did you tell her, Brad?" I asked, voice soft, but steady. "That you're barely staying afloat, that you maxed out your credit cards just to make the down payment, that the bank owns most of what you claim is yours." The silence that followed was thick. Diane looked at Brad like he was a stranger. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "You're lying," he said finally, flat and desperate. "You don't know what you're talking about." I leaned forward, rested my elbows lightly on the table. "If I'm lying," I said, "then show Mom your bank statements, your mortgage balance, your credit score." He didn't move, didn't speak. And that was all the proof anyone needed. Diane's napkin twisted between her fingers as if it might hold the room together. "Brad," she whispered, "tell me she's wrong." He laughed. It was sharp dry, the kind of sound that collapses in on itself. "She's just trying to stir things up," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "She doesn't know what she's talking about." I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. "If I'm wrong," I said, "then prove it." That was all. No yelling, no accusations, just calm, measured words. And it gutted him more than shouting ever could. Brad's jaw tightened so hard I could see the muscle twitch beneath his skin. Diane looked at him, really looked maybe for the first time in years. The certainty in her face was gone, replaced by something heavier. Doubt. "Show me," she said. "Brad." Show me. He opened his mouth, closed it. His hand ran through his hair, and suddenly he didn't look composed. He looked like a boy caught in a lie too big to explain away. Finally, his voice came small and cornered. Fine, he muttered. It's 300. The breath left Diane's lungs in a slow, audible exhale. 300,000, she said, barely getting the words out. It's not that bad, he rushed. It's temporary. I have a plan. I'm restructuring. But it didn't matter what he said. The spell had broken. For years, she had paraded him around like a trophy, like everything he touched turned to gold. And now, in the same room where she'd spent decades praising him, the truth sat between them like a third guest at the table. You let me tell everyone you bought that house outright. Diane said, her voice trembling. You let me believe I didn't ask you to. He cut in, voice harsh. But it was too late. The image she'd wrapped her identity around Brad, the success, Brad the example, was cracked. And everyone at that table could see it. I sat still. No need to twist the knife. It had already sunk deep enough. For the first time in my life, Diane didn't know what to say. And Brad. He looked like a man who'd built his kingdom on sand and just heard the tide rolling in. The silence after his confession wasn't awkward. It was arresting. Lisa sat back, eyes wide. Aunt Barb blinked at her plate like she couldn't remember how to hold her fork. Even the turkey seemed to cool faster in the air. Brad's knee bounced under the table, nervous energy with nowhere to go. He looked like a man who had counted on one thing all his life, that no matter what, Diane would be in his corner. But she wasn't speaking. She just stared at him, quiet, unmoving. Her hands folded in her lap now as if even they had surrendered. He turned to me. You think you've won something here? He snapped. You really needed to humiliate me at Thanksgiving. Natalie? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I didn't humiliate you, I said evenly. You did that all by yourself. His nostrils flared, his jaw tightened again, but this time he had no comeback, no snide remark, just breathing shallow and defensive. I looked at Diane. You never asked about my career, my life, my choices. I said, my voice calm but undeniable. You assumed if I wasn't like Brad, I was failing. But I didn't fail. I just stopped reporting to a system that never included me. Her lips parted slightly, a protest maybe, but no words came out. For a long time, I'd told myself her favoritism didn't matter, that I was above it. But now, watching her face shift under the weight of reality, I realized something else. I had never needed her pride. I had only needed her honesty. And that, at last, was starting to show. Brad stood abruptly. His chair scraped back hard on the floor. I'm done, he muttered. I don't need to sit here and be judged. Funny, I said, folding my napkin. That's what I've been doing for years. He didn't answer. He just walked away. The sound of his footsteps retreating down the hall was the loudest thing in the house. When the front door shut behind him, Diane still hadn't moved. But something in the room had, and this time the shift wasn't temporary. It stuck. I didn't speak right away. I let the silence breathe. Diane sat still, her fingers laced tightly in her lap. Her eyes hadn't moved from the doorway where Brad had disappeared, but her expression had. No longer proud, no longer assured, just lost. For once, the person left in the room with her wasn't the one who needed explaining. It was her. You always assumed I was behind, I said quietly. You never asked where I was actually going. Her gaze shifted to me then. Slowly, like she wasn't sure she wanted to meet my eyes. But she did. Do you really think I never cared? She asked, and there was something softer in her voice, thin, almost threadbare. I think you cared about the version of me you could understand, I answered. The one who didn't challenge your view of success. The one who let you measure everything in square footage job titles and polite stories you could tell your friends. She blinked. Once. Twice. Then looked down at her hands. Aunt Barb cleared her throat. Natalie, she said gently, why didn't you tell anyone what you were building? I smiled, not bitter, not smug. Just honest. Because none of you ever asked. Not really. They'd asked about holidays, about the weather, but not about the long nights I'd spent building my business. Not about the risks I took or the wins that no one saw. They hadn't even asked if I was okay when I skipped 2 Thanksgivings in a row. They'd just assumed I was drifting. Diane looked at me again, and this time I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Not regret, recognition. Maybe for the first time she wasn't seeing me through the lens of comparison. Maybe now she was seeing the woman who'd quietly done what none of them thought she could, and didn't need them to. I stood up slowly. No rush, no dramatics. Just the quiet scrape of my chair and the weight of every Thanksgiving past falling away behind me. I reached for my purse, slid the strap over my shoulder, adjusted my coat with a calmness I hadn't felt in years. No one spoke. Diane didn't stop me. She didn't ask me to stay. She didn't try to salvage whatever remained between us. And maybe that was the most telling thing of all. I looked around the room one last time. Brad's empty chair sat like an exclamation point to the whole night. Aunt Barb stared down at her plate hands folded tight. Lisa looked at me, just looked like she was seeing me for the first time and trying to catch up. I turned to Diane. Her eyes were glossy, her lips parted, but she said nothing. Just watched me as if expecting a final blow, a cruel remark, some triumphant jab. But I didn't need that. I didn't leave to hurt anyone. I left because finally I didn't owe anyone here an explanation. Next time you want to know about my life, I said, voice steady low without edge, maybe try actually listening. And with that, I opened the front door. The cold evening air met my face crisp and quiet. A world outside this dining room where I wasn't someone's shadow or comparison or disappointment, just me. I stepped out into it. No applause, no gasps. No final words trailing after me. Only peace. The kind that doesn't come from proving anything. Only from finally letting go of trying.